legalizefreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Listen without limits. Unchain your brain. Change your thinking. Change your life. legalizefreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to legalizefreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat. My guest today is Bruce Scofield, who joins us to discuss his book, The Nature of Astrology, History, Philosophy, and the Science of Self-Organizing Systems. Our ancient ancestors recorded the rhythms of the sun, moon, planets, and stars, correlating these rhythms with weather, plant growth, and animal and human behaviours. From these early geo-cosmic recordings came calendars, astronomy, and astrology. While astrology is now mostly viewed as subjective fortune-telling, Scofield argues that astrology is not only a practice but also a science, specifically a form of systems science, a set of techniques for mapping and analysing self-organising systems. Providing clear evidence that our solar system neighbours profoundly affect and shape life on our planet, the author shares modern biological and climate studies on the effects of Earth's rotation, the sun, the moon, and the rhythms of light, gravity, magnetism, and solar radiation on terrestrial processes. He explores the early practice of astrometeorology, a method of weather forecasting used from ancient times into the Renaissance, revealing the links between the solar system, weather, and climate over large spans of time. He shares his own studies on the correlations between Saturn's position and terrestrial weather, as well as presenting a wealth of evidence on astrological effects and the theories and mechanics behind them. Presenting a broad look at how the cosmic environment shapes nature, Scofield shows how the practice and natural science of astrology can expand its applications in modern society, helping us understand ourselves and our place in the universe. Hello and welcome, Bruce, and thank you so much for joining us today on legalizefreedom.com.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.
Bruce, today we're going to be talking about your new book. It's entitled The Nature of Astrology, History, Philosophy, and the Science of Self-Organizing Systems. Before we dive into that, just tell listeners a little bit about your background and your work in general.
Okay, I've been involved in astrology since, I guess, the late 1960s, and at the same time, I've had an interest in science. When I was young, I was interested in geology and astronomy. And I had these circumstances where I noticed I was meeting and having relationships with people born on the same day over and over again. And this brought me into astrology. And so I spent a lot of my early life trying to reconcile those 2 points of view. But I did manage to make a living at astrology for about 45 years, I guess. And towards the end of that, I managed to get a PhD in geosciences at the University of Massachusetts and taught there for about 15 years. And I'm retired now. So the book is basically a product of my entire life in both science and astrology, which some people find very confusing and counterintuitive.
Well, that really cuts to the heart of what we're going to be talking about. Some people saying astrology, of course, is like profoundly unscientific. But of course, it wasn't always that way. Astrology, astronomy, it was really, and speaking as an interested amateur here, to me, it seems in my reading of it, there was a time when it really was kind of one thing, different aspects of one study of the heavens and the movements of these and correlations, with events on Earth, whether that be, as you say, in the geosciences or in, human events, and these correspondences being mapped over time, telling us that something was going on. I have to say that by coincidence or not, I had someone ask recently if I could recommend any books on astrology, sort of ones that were going to, actually take the route that yours does, And it was just, again, it just so happened to have just finished reading yours. So the book is outstanding, if you don't mind me saying so. And it really is going to be for people who are skeptical, I would say, about astrology, but perhaps interested enough. I think this is the book they need to read. So I recommended your book, and that's up there with Richard Tarnas, Cosmos and Psyche, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, he's also has a background in academics as well.
Yeah, exactly. So perhaps we could say something about that, how astrology and astronomy, the commonalities between the two, how that has changed over time to the point where I think actually I hope that we're moving into a new era of of appreciation for astrology and what it can tell us, what it can give us, we can listen to, the voices of these like heavenly bodies rather than just observe their movements. But certainly we could say that with the scientific revolution and this rise of materialism and rationalism and reductionism in science, that astrology became sidelined. So maybe we could just do a sort of potted history of that, how the appreciation for or the skepticism about astrology has changed over the centuries.
Yeah, I think very early on, like in ancient Mesopotamia, astrology, astronomy, and calendar science and navigation were all pretty much linked together. There wasn't much of a distinction, but by the time of the Hellenistic period, which began shortly after Alexander's conquests, you began to see astrology moving into Greek territory, and the Greeks applying geometry to it and building it into a more tightly organized system. And so by about 150 AD, you have Ptolemy, who is considered the greatest scientist of the ancient world, being very clear about the distinction between astronomy and astrology. He wrote a massive book on astronomy, and he also wrote a book on astrology, which a lot of people consider to be the classic founding work, although there are others as well. So the distinction was there. And I think for the next 1,500 years or so, people that did mathematics, people that did astronomy, and people that did astrology were often the same person, or they maybe favored one over the other, but there wasn't much of a distinction. And a lot of work was put into the mathematics of calculating the chart. And out of that work, we got trigonometry. But trigonometry was pretty much done by the 17th century. And that's about the same time as the scientific revolution, when there was a shift from science as being basically logic and close observation to science being experiment and mathematical modeling, which is reductionist in its nature. In order to do an experiment, you have to take things out of context and put them in a study situation. So two things were happening on the intellectual level around the 17th century that affected astrology. Again, one was the fact that there wasn't so much of a demand for the mathematics anymore, and observations were better. The telescope had been invented. And the change in the way science was done. And one of the problems astrology had was it was not reducible as other subjects were. You could take, in physics, for example, you can roll a ball down a ramp or drop a stone, and you can measure that. And you can apply numbers to it, units. And then with the units, you can mathematically model it, come up with a formula. But it was very difficult to do with astrology. It was impossible to do, really. And some attempts were made. There was a teacher named John Goad, who in the 17th century did a very complex and lengthy analysis and study of the correlations between astrological aspects, planetary aspects, and weather. He did that in London. And it was a well-respected work. People from the Royal Society respected it, but it couldn't go anywhere because he couldn't model it with mathematics. And not only that, his weather records weren't that good because this was really before the time of thermometers and barometers and so on. So the barometer had been invented, but it was hard to get your hands on one. And I think he did get his hands on one towards the end of his study. But in other words, without instrumentation and without mathematics, you really couldn't fit into the trend at the time. Now, if this had happened a few centuries later, there would have been statistics, and that would have been, you could have done something with it, which is how astrology is tested today. Statistics are the way. But that, on the scientific, intellectual level, is what happened to astrology. But there are other social trends, historical trends that really pushed astrology from center stage off into the closet.
I mean, when I first encountered astrology, it was, you won't be surprised to hear this, like in the 1980s when I was a teenager. It was in the tabloid newspaper, and it was a little column. In fact, the astrologer that I put astrologer in air quotes because I don't really know how deep her knowledge was, but there was an astrologer in one of the national newspapers in the UK, Mystic Meg, and she recently died, actually, because her obituary was all over the news. And she would do the little horoscopes, that would appear only about less than 100 words each. Yeah. And when I later came to be very interested in astronomy through watching, again, the longest running TV show on UK television, The Sky at Night, hosted for many decades by Sir Patrick Moore, I became interested in astronomy. And then I started to read about astrology in some of the astronomy books. So I just wondered at the time, how did what you're referring to, those ancient origins become boiled down to something as throwaway as, you will meet a tall, handsome stranger or whatever in the horoscope, because there must have been serious work going on. There must have been almost like an astrological underground to keep the discipline, to keep the study going, or maybe it didn't move forward for a long time. I don't know. Again, this is something I'm kind of working backward now to try and figure out.
Well, it didn't go anywhere for a long time. What happened was in the 17th century, it dropped out of, cutting edge science and intellectual life, or, at least parts of it were involved there. It's a complex history. But anyway, it dropped out and went down to the middle class and the lower classes, stayed alive more in England than anywhere else in Europe. And it was only at the end of the 19th century that it started reviving itself, and that has continued, pretty steadily since then. One comment though, this is, I think, important. I want to clarify it. People use the term horoscope when they see a list of predictions in a newspaper column or a magazine, and it's labeled that way, but that's so incorrect. Horoscope is a Greek word which means view of the hour or hour marker, and it refers to the ascendant, which is also known as the rising sign. So those little blurbs are not horoscopes, but they're called horoscopes. I just want to clear that up. Pass that out there to anybody who's interested. If you look at a chart of the positions of the planets for a specific time and place, it's not really called a horoscope, although a lot of people do. It should be called an astrological chart or a birth chart if it's a chart of a person.
Of course, and this is explained in detail in your book. I simply used the word horoscope, of course, because that's what we referred to those at the time, albeit incorrectly. Talking about coming at it from an astronomical point of view, many people seem quite willing to accept or are very, at ease with, even if they haven't done any study of it, the idea, for example, that the moon has effects on systems on the Earth, the tides being the best known, perhaps, and don't have any problem accepting that, and that the sun has an effect on all the bodies throughout the solar system, of course, but we notice it here on Earth. But they're still very resistant to any of the ideas, for example, that they might encounter in your book. And I think that's because they assume that all the effects have to be like purely kind of kinetic. They understand that a planetary body can collide with the Earth, for example, maybe that the event that the dinosaurs were already in decline when that extinction event occurred, but they can accept that sort of thing can happen. Or you can have something like the Carrington events, with the electromagnetic pulse,
Yep.
or the event over Tunguska, things like that. But it's all purely kinetic as they're saying it. But that's why they struggle, because they think that's the only way any of this can have an effect on systems on the Earth at whatever scale.
Yeah. Well, the sun and moon certainly have plenty of effects, and some of the effects are pretty subtle. You can have a very small influence or force turn a whole system upside down if it comes at the right time. System here is the operating word, because one of the arguments I make in the book is that there's a class of phenomena called systems, or generally called systems, self-organizing systems, things like a cell, an organ, a body, and that these systems have emergent properties. Like an emergent property of the brain is the mind, and out of that, being shaped by behaviors and habits and memories and whatnot, emerges a personality. And then you have personalities in communication with each other, and you have a network of some sort of information going back and forth. And that network has it's an emergent property coming from many different individuals. And something like the stock market could be described as a self-organizing system as well. So these self-organizing systems turn out to be very sensitive to small influences. So the first point really is that we don't need to have a massive kinetic event to have effects on systems on the Earth. And there are plenty of examples that are, treated as normal by scientists, where something like small amounts of solar radiation can tip the balance in the climate system one way or the other, or in weather, or in a person's state of mind. Don't always need a big force.
Well, you mentioned state of mind, and that's, you're getting into or touching upon one of the areas in all of this that's most interest to me, and that is in our in biological systems, and in our case, of course, in human beings. You write about the effects on the biosphere. That fits in with your scientific background. Then there's this thing called the noosphere, which perhaps we can say a word about, and then the ethosphere, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, and that's where it starts to get incredibly interesting for me, because I remember reading in some, it wasn't the 14 Times, it would have been one of these strange and startling type magazine things again back when I was a teenager, about sunspots and their association with strange phenomena and human events, and there's no reason to think, especially when we were talking about systems, that whatever scale you're looking at, as you say, down to cellular or atomic, why interconnection wouldn't be a factor. I guess quantum science is telling us something about this at the largest scale, right? From the smallest scale to the largest scale, and why the movement of planetary bodies around or any of them around the solar system wouldn't kind of act a little bit like pinballs or billiard balls. Because something doesn't have to come into contact with something else to have an effect on it, not only in physical contact.
Yeah, with things like gravity and electromagnetic, forces, that's obvious. You don't need to touch anything. These things can tip off conditions. I was going to inject this. This is actually in response to your previous comment. It's pretty much known that the sun and moon do have a strong effect on life and the biosphere and weather and the climate system. Nobody's really arguing about that. The arguments are in the details. And I spend a couple chapters on that in the book. So if you're of a scientific mind, you will read the first two chapters and say, well, this is really interesting. Yeah, these things are going on. I knew some of it, but I may not have known all of it, because I bring in a lot of information that's not that well known. Things like how bacteria can sense the Earth's magnetic field and use it for navigation. But when you get to the other planets, that's where trouble begins, because people will say, okay, sun and moon, they're large bodies, or at least the moon is close and the sun is a very large body, and they do have gravitational influences, and the sun has the solar wind blowing on us. So that makes a lot of sense. But it's the other planets. How could they possibly affect us? So what I did for my PhD thesis was take weather data, daily weather data, long time series from different parts of the world, many of them, and check to see if there was any correlation between temperatures and the planet Saturn. I picked Saturn largely because that was suggested by Johannes Kepler in one of his books on astrology. He put that out there, Sun-Saturn angular relationships, or specifically Sun-Saturn syzygies. That is, Saturn and the Sun are on one or the other side of the Earth in a straight line, correlate with weather changes, cold weather changes. And other astrologers said that. In fact, that was a kind of a universal notion that goes back 2,000 years. Astrologers agree that Saturn's associated with cold weather. So I took all these weather data sets and analyzed them in ways that would cancel out any kind of seasonal effects. And I got some interesting results showing that there was a consistent correlation with a drop in temperatures just as the syzygy was forming, and then it went back up again. And it's stronger in some parts of the world than others, and that makes sense because climate, or weather rather, is not the same everywhere. Depends on the location. I happen to live in New England, and we have, I don't live near the ocean. I live into New England, and we're affected by these large cold air masses that come down from Canada. So where I live would be considered continental. But if you live right on the, or near the ocean, you have a very different kind of weather situation. That's, it's more temperate because of the capacity of the ocean to hold heat, stabilize things. So you're going to get different results in different places, but I got enough results in enough different places to show that this was not a fluke. My PhD committee was a little surprised by it, but the work I did was solid. And I do present that in the book, some of it. I had a paper published on it, a peer-reviewed paper. And that's, to my knowledge, the first time somebody has actually done that, shown a clear correlation between Saturn and cold. There were a couple other studies that worked with Mars, one from the Netherlands. I don't recall the details offhand, but it's very rare to find people investigating this sort of thing, correlations with weather and planets. And the truth is Saturn's gravitational influence on Earth is 4 orders of magnitude less than that of the Sun. Now, that's a calculation based on the mass of Saturn and the mass of the Earth's atmosphere. But I found a correlation between the two, a significant correlation. Well, what are we going to do with that?
Well, what are we going to do with that?
Well, there's more work to be done. I'm tired and I don't have all that much energy left these days. But I did the same study for Jupiter. You would think that Jupiter, a bigger mass than Saturn and closer, would produce the same effect, but it doesn't. What it actually does is it produces a peak in precipitation. Go figure.
So where we're going, I mean, this is like, okay, so we're observing these effects or this correlation with weather conditions. What we've really got, I think, in the observable universe, I think it's just one massive system. That's how it makes sense to me anyway, that although effects in distant parts of it may not necessarily register it in a meaningful way or in a way that can be observed or measured or quantified. For example, we have taking it beyond the weather, for example, then the implication is that the forces, whatever word we want to use, that are affecting something like the weather would affect other systems. I mentioned earlier, biological systems of most interest to us ourselves. And we have, the light levels, for example, at different times of the year can affect people differently. I tend to be pretty happy all year round. Whatever the weather is, however, whatever time it gets dark doesn't bother me. But some people have, I can't remember what it's called, but some people have a real kind of difficult time in the winter with short days and a lot of darkness.
Seasonal affective disorder.
Yeah, particularly if they live in, parts of the world, maybe where it's cold and wet and it's just generally, inhospitable, then, this is a real thing. And I've read about, the effect of cosmic rays, for example, on life on Earth and, the Earth and being bombarded constantly with these things and the effect that this has on the body and on the brain, and as you mentioned, emergent property there for the mind. So, but I think at some point in that kind of line that I've traced there, a kind of wall of resistance comes up, just saying, oh, well, we can accept that these forces, whatever we're dealing with, are having an effect on the weather systems on Earth, or indeed on other planets. Maybe they affect us biologically in some way, but it seems when it comes to questions of not just affecting people's moods, but affecting, well, let's face it, a lot of the events in human society, well, they're generated by humans. We start and stop wars. We have a renaissance, or we have a dark age, or whatever. So depending on how we're feeling at the time and how we view each other, how we view our place on the Earth, how we view our place in the solar system or in the wider cosmos, if we see meaning and purpose and all of that, those are products of the mind. And if that's ultimately affected by these extraterrestrial forces, I'm not talking about aliens, of course, here folks talking about forces off Earth, then why wouldn't the study, that you're talking about, why wouldn't this data, this information, these observations be relevant ultimately to human affairs?
Well, I think they are. It's just that there's a lot of resistance to it for many reasons. I think the primary one goes way back, and it has to do with any thought of astrology immediately connects with thoughts of fatalism and determinism, and that's anathema to religion, which requires choice, and it requires choice. It requires the power of prayer, the use of an intermediary priest of some sort. So it's a deep problem that I think that's embedded in more so maybe in the Western mind, collective mind, than other parts of the world. But that's fear of losing this illusion of free will. Although you look at the neuroscience today, and what you find is that we hardly have free will at all. Decisions are made, and then we think we made the decision. That our body is making the decision.
Well, I mean, I think that's never more apparent than at the moment in our times. With our information age, we're saturated in it, coming from all angles. Information overload. Information is not wisdom necessarily, and so we can see it as plain as day. We don't have to speculate about it, about people's decisions, and that's what advertising and propaganda is built on. I'm going to buy this, this brand of whatever breakfast cereal. Yeah, this is my choice. Well, it's not, because you've been programmed to desire this. So, yeah, I mean that's just a modern iteration of it, really. But it just really highlights this good parallel, I suppose, to use in terms of, you say, free will and making our own decisions. But even with the best, pardon the pun, with the best will in the world, those of us that try to live life as consciously as we can, we understand there are other forces at work, not least other people that may derail us, that may change, make us take a different path or change course or make different decisions, or, think that something we thought was a good idea isn't a good idea anymore. No man is an island and all that. We don't live in a bubble. So,
yeah, we're certainly not isolated. One thing you said a little earlier struck me. You talked about basically an all-encompassing system, and then systems within systems, right? You pointed in that direction in your thinking.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like nested, like Russian dolls or whatever.
Yeah, and I think Arthur Koestler called it a holarchy. There were holons, which were like a complete system in itself, and from the position of a holon, it subsumes lesser holons, and it's subsumed by bigger ones, right? So it's like the Russian dolls. But So there is this idea that astrological information coming from the larger solar system percolates through, downwards, we could call it that, into these other systems, social systems and the biosphere and so on. And you get multiple effects coming from the same signal. So, for example, last month, there was a 90-degree aspect formed between the sun and the planet Uranus, geocentrically. In other words, if you're on your Earth, you're looking at the sun, you measure 90 degrees ahead in the zodiac, and there is Uranus. And not only that, but at the halfway point between them, the midpoint, is the vernal equinox, or was the vernal equinox. So this was a symmetry had been established. And there's more to it than that, but that was the main part of it. And that happened in early February. And what occurred at that time was the Turkey-Syria earthquake and the American downing of the Chinese spy balloon. And I saw this as a very interesting example of the same signal coming out in two different forms. One very physical, and the other one a national, the nation being kind of a collective mindset, a self-organizing system itself. These group self-organizing systems are interesting because they outlast the people that are in them.
It's almost like an egregore or something.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's a national character that persists over time. It's a very interesting thing. The formation of a nation presents an opportunity for the historian to see the formation of a self-organizing system.
That concludes part 1 of our interview. Part 2 will be available soon in the subscribers area at legalizefreedom.com.
legalizefreedom.com